I'm going to now introduce our speaker, Dr. Hany Farid. He is a professor at the University of California, Berkeley here, with a joint appointment in electrical engineering and computer science and the School of Information. His research focuses on digital forensics, forensic science, misinformation and image analysis, and human perception. He received his undergraduate degree in computer science and applied mathematics from the University of Rochester in 1989 and his PhD in computer science from the University of Pennsylvania in 1997, following a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship in brain and cognitive science at MIT. He joined the faculty at Dartmouth College in 1999, where he remained up until 2019, and aren't we so lucky to have him? He is the recipient of an Alfred P. Sloan Fellowship, a John Simons Guggenheim Fellowship, and is a fellow of the National Academy of Inventors. So lots of accolades. Again, we're so lucky to have him, so let's give him a round of applause. I'm going to ask that, would you mind if folks ask questions during the lecture or save them all for the end?
I'm the only one who talks when I'm on the stage.
No, sorry. This can be fun.
You should absolutely interrupt me, raise your hand, yell if I don't see you. I'm happy to take questions as we go along.
Great, and then I'm going to ask that you repeat those questions after they're asked for everyone in the audience and so that our camera folks can pick up the questions.
Fantastic.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming out on a Saturday morning. It's good to see everybody here. We're going to talk about, this is a two-part talk. We're going to talk about disinformation and deepfakes, and they're a little related, and you'll see how in a minute. Let me start by acknowledging the students who have been working on these problems over the last many years now. Shruti Agarwal, now Dr. Agarwal, who is now a postdoc at MIT. She was a grad student here with me. Matthias Bohacek, who is a new student working with me on the deepfakes. Mark Fadul, who graduated a few years ago. And now Professor Sophie Nightingale, who's a postdoc with me here, and now is faculty back in the UK. And all four of these really amazing students have done all the heavy lifting and the work that I'm going to describe today. So let's start with disinformation, and then we'll transition over to deepfakes. So the problem of disinformation, I don't think will surprise you, is not new. Back in 2015, before all hell really broke loose in the last few years, interesting statistics from public policy polling. 4% of people in the US believe that lizard people control society. This is not a euphemism. These are people who literally believe that members of Congress are lizards with a human skin. Now, I've been to Capitol Hill many times. I understand where that belief comes from, but I'm pretty sure it's not true. I just realized this is going to be on YouTube, by the way. Not the weirdest thing on YouTube, by the way. 7% of people believe that the moon landing was fake. 14% of people believe that Bigfoot exists, and 15% of people believe that the US government adds mind-controlling technology to television. Okay? Now, if you had asked me back in 2015, is this a problem, I would have said, I don't care. Relatively small numbers, who cares if you believe stupid things? It's your right to do that, and who might get involved in that? And I would have been wrong, and here's why I would have been wrong. Because I didn't understand something. And what I didn't understand is that belief in conspiracies erodes trust in governments, in the media, and in scientists, and the very institutions that we need when we are facing a global pandemic, when we are trying to have democratic elections, when we are trying to tackle climate change, when we are having serious conversations about social justice. And what you have to understand about the lizard people and the moon landing and the mind-controlled television, it's not just that you believe something that is factually incorrect or not substantiated by the science. It's that you believe there is an effort to conceal that information from you. And that effort is being driven by powers, by the governments and the media and the scientists and the academics. And that's the problem with conspiracies. And that's what set the stage, I would argue, for the last few years, where we have seen a massive increase in misinformation and conspiracies. So that in 2020, 2021, at the height and the beginning of the pandemic, we saw some really troubling increases in the belief of things that were not true. So Sophie Nightingale, you saw a picture of her earlier on, and I did a series of surveys in the early days of the pandemic, and here's what we found. 17% of Americans believe the core tenets of QAnon, that Satan-worshipping cannibalistic pedophiles plotted against Trump. 22% of people believe that Bill Gates uses vaccines to implant tracking devices on microchips. By the way, this is neither here nor there, but I would like to ask those people who believe that Bill Gates did this to put a tracking microchip, why, first of all, why does he care where you are? But second of all, we have all voluntarily strapped the mother of all tracking devices to our face 24 hours a day. I don't have to implant a tracking device in you. We are all being tracked. Okay, so just saying. 37% of Americans believe global warming is a hoax. Not that it's not happening, but that it is a hoax. And 53% of Republicans believe that Trump is the rightful president. And now you are seeing some troubling statistics that have to ask the question, how do you respond to a global pandemic when 1 in 5 people believe that there's going to be a microchip and they're not going to get vaccinated? How do you tackle climate change when 1/3 of Americans believe it's a hoax? And how do you have a democracy if half of an entire party will not believe the outcome of an election? And now we have gone from the flat earthers, the tinfoil hat, we can make fun of them, to existential threats to society and democracy. And now it's not so funny anymore. And now we have to start getting serious. Now, I was talking a few years ago with my former postdoc advisor, and he said, Hany, I'm really glad you're working on this, but it's hopeless. Like, it's just, we're doomed. And the reason why he said we're doomed, that was a really depressing conversation. The reason he said we're doomed is this. More than half of Americans now get their news, if you can call it that, on social media. That should terrify you, by the way. By the way, the younger generation are now starting to use TikTok instead of Google to find information. That should terrify you also. Why does it seem hopeless? Because on Facebook, there are about 700,000 posts per minute. There's about 500 hours of video uploaded every minute on both YouTube and TikTok. And on Twitter, there's about 350,000 tweets per minute. It is the mother of all fire hoses of, if you can call it this, information. And when you think about that volume, how do you fact check yourself out of this? How do you deal with this absolute deluge of information that is not just neutral? It is being targeted in very specific ways to individuals. So when I get onto TikTok, I see something different than you see based on my past habits. And so when you think about this volume, you're like, holy crap, we are in a lot of trouble. Let's just unplug the internet and be done with it. But I'm going to posit that it's not quite as hopeless as it seems, and here's why. If you go over to YouTube and you watch this video talk that I gave a few years ago, you'll see something really interesting, which is you'll see a bunch of recommendations on the right here. And if you haven't turned it off, YouTube will start another video after mine is done. And as a matter of fact, 70% of all YouTube watched videos are not organic. They are recommended by YouTube. So you go over there and watch some video that your friends send you, and guess what? You end up watching another one and another one and another one. 70%. And how is YouTube deciding what to show you? Well, they're tracking you, right? They're tracking you on your phone, they're tracking your web browser, they're tracking your watching history, and they're trying to find things that you'll watch. Why? Because they want to deliver ads. Why? Because that's how they make money. Okay. So, I would argue that if we think about this underlying mechanism, this recommendation algorithm, maybe the scale and the problem seems a little different. And of course on Facebook, 100% of the content that you see, first of all, you should delete your Facebook account. If you take nothing else from this talk, this is it. Delete Facebook, and yes, delete YouTube too while you're at it. Okay, or at least don't go there. 100% of YouTube, Facebook content is recommended. TikTok is the same way, and Twitter also has very strong recommendations because the underlying business model of social media is engagement. We engage you because we are interested in your time and your attention, so we can deliver ads and get you to buy stuff that you don't need. Okay, so we wanted to understand the nature of these recommendation algorithms. What are they doing? Okay, so here's what we did. This is work with Mark Fadul. Over a 16-month period, from October of 18 through the early days of the pandemic, we probed YouTube's Watch Next algorithm. So that's the thing that you see on the right. on 1,000 news-based channels. So think BBC, NPR, New York Times, Fox News, MSNBC, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They all have channels. We simulated watching a video, and then we looked to see what was recommended. Okay? And we did this using VPNs and anonymous accounts, and so to sort of have a really randomized and unbiased view. So I wasn't logged into my account to see what it was recommending to me. And over this, from October 18 to February of 2020, we collected over 10 million recommendations from YouTube. Okay? And we're going to tell you a little bit about what we found. So what we were so first of all, I should have said this at the beginning of the talk. Mis and disinformation are very hard to define. Sometimes we don't know things, and sometimes we just disagree on something. So what we went after is something very specific, which are conspiracies, which we define with 4 core tenets. It explains events as secret plots by powerful forces or alien forces. It contradicts the scientific consensus. It is not supported by any evidence, and it is a self-fulfilling or unfalsified theory, which means that if somebody comes out with evidence against a flat Earth, then they are simply part of the conspiracy. And that's the self-fulfilling prophecy. And if it satisfies those 4 or 3 or 4 of those criteria, we are going to call that a conspiracy. And that is fairly objective and uncontroversial, and that's why we're going to focus specifically on conspiracies. Okay.
How many people believe the Earth is flat?
How many people believe the Earth is flat? That number, by the way, is rising. I think it's hovering at around 10%. Yeah, by the way, we're talking about whether the Earth is flat again. All right, this is where we are. God help us all. So, first thing we need to do is figure out whether a video is conspiratorial or not. Right? And we have 10 million recommendations, so we can't watch these videos. So we built a classifier. Let me tell you how we did that. We looked at 3 parts of a video. The comments, what people say on a video. The snippets, which is a little abstract or a little short sentence that the creator of the video makes. And then a transcription of the video. So we take the audio stream in, we transcribe it, audio to text, and we look at what is actually being said in the video. And so then we do just some really simple natural language processing to look at the language being used. And here's what we found. It's actually pretty easy to find conspiracies, and here's why. In the comments section, those words are most often prevalent in the comments associated with conspiratorial videos. Illuminati, evil, research, deep hoax, global control, believe, autism, satanic, and here's my favorite one, they. They are doing this. Who? They. The snippets. They use the word conspiracy. It's the #1 predictor of whether a video is conspiracy. The title says conspiracy. This is not hard to find. Warming, truth, hoax, prophecy, Illuminati, supernatural, deception, and evidence. And then the transcripts are information, NASA, weather, warming, evidence, climate, vaccines, ancient, and aluminum. By the way, the transcript, the actual video, is the least predictive. The comments were all the action is. That's where it gets interesting. By the way, the reason is that if your video is too crazy, even for YouTube, it gets taken down. So they have figured out that they have to walk this line a little bit.
Why aluminum?
Why aluminum? First of all, don't ask questions like that, because it's the internet. There is a belief that chemtrails have aluminum in it, and this part of the, yeah, don't even get me started. By the way, I have to say the worst part of this research is you should see my browsing history. It's not pretty. Okay, so we watched every day. We watched videos, we simulated watching videos, and we looked to see what was recommended. We took all those videos, we shoved them into a classifier, and we predicted conspiratorial or not conspiratorial. And what I'm going to plot for you here is time. So this is November of 18 to January of 20. And what I'm plotting on the vertical axis is the percent of videos that were recommended, remember, on news-based channels. Right? So that means you go to BBC and you watch a video from BBC and you get recommended videos. At its peak, in January of 19, close to 10% of videos recommended by YouTube's algorithm were conspiratorial. That is insane. 10%. Remember, 70% of all watched videos are because of the recommendation algorithms. Okay, so there we are at the peak of the insanity on YouTube. By the way, I thought this number was going to be like 2 or 3%. In February of 19, under increasing pressure from the media and from regulators and from their advertisers, YouTube announced that we're going to do something about this. We are going to fight, they call it borderline content, we call it crazy stuff. We thought, great, we had already started the study, let's see what happens. This is fantastic. We're going to do a real-time analysis of what YouTube is saying they're going to do and if they actually do it. And so we watched. And from February to about March, April, nothing happened. But then you see this precipitous drop. So that by June, that number is now around 2.5%, 3%. And as a matter of fact, at exactly that low point, almost down to the day, Facebook puts out a press release saying, we have countered disinformation. I think they exaggerated how well they did, but they did do something, and you can see a pretty precipitous drop. They did something. And it's very predictable, and we're going to come back to what happened there. And then we kept watching. We're like, all right, let's see what happens. And then it sort of bounced around. Unfortunately, we stopped the study just before the beginning of the pandemic, because the student graduated and we were resource limited. We believe that number probably has gone up and is now hovering at about 4, 5, 6%. It's about down by about a half. Okay, so success. Still a big number, by the way. That's still a lot of videos being recommended. But it also hides an important detail. Okay? And here's the important detail, which is that when we were watching, or simulated watching, we were having all kinds of different videos we were watching. So we watched a totally normal video on BBC about climate change, and then we'd be given a conspiratorial video about climate change. But that's not really how the internet works. When you start watching videos over and over and over again, I recently had to fix my bike. So I went online and went to YouTube, and I watched video, how do you change disc brakes on a bike? And now all I get are videos about disc brakes, right? And that's what happens, right? Because they think that's what, don't understand that you only have to fix them once. But okay, fine. So what I'm going to show you here is now the conditional probability of a conspiratorial recommendation, by which I mean that if you watch one conspiratorial video, what happens next? And in fact, between in late 18 and early 19, if you watched the conspiratorial video, you were 70% likely to get another conspiracy. And then in that gap, when YouTube said we're going to do something but didn't, that number went to 54%, and then after they fixed things, it's 30%. So that 3 or 4% sounds good, but it's not nearly as good as it sounds, because if you, either intentionally or unintentionally, watch something conspiratorial, you have a 1 in 3 chance of seeing another conspiratorial video. This is the so-called rabbit hole or echo chamber that is social media, that once you start going down that dark tunnel, you don't get out, because YouTube's like, I see what you're interested in. They don't distinguish between QAnon and conspiracies and how do you fix your bicycle. So the numbers aren't quite as good as YouTube wants us to believe. Now, what happened here in the middle? So I started this conversation by saying, this is a hopeless problem. Way too much content, but maybe it's not as bad as we think it is. So what did YouTube do? How did they fix this problem? And so we just got so unbelievably lucky, as is often the case in science, that we had started this analysis before YouTube made the change, and we saw the change and afterwards. So we can go back and look to see what changed. And here's the only thing that we could find as a difference, is 12 channels simply stopped being recommended. That's the only thing we saw. 12 channels are responsible for half of the conspiracies. So I told you earlier that 500 hours of video are uploaded to YouTube every minute. This is an impossible problem. But if there's only 12 channels that are responsible for half the problem, I can cut the head off the snake, and I can solve a big chunk of the problem. And I don't even have to deplatform you. Just stop recommending. You can post whatever you want. But if it's not recommended, if something's on a 5th page of a Google search, does it actually exist? It's like that philosopher, like a tree falls in the woods, right? It's not just YouTube. On Facebook, we know that 12 people are responsible for half of COVID-related disinformation. That's insane. One person was responsible for most of election disinformation. You can decide who it is. This problem is not nearly as bad as it seems. So now you got to ask the question, why? Why is Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube allowing this? Because that one person and those 12 people and those 12 channels have tens and hundreds of millions of followers. They are good for business. Right? Outrage and crazy is good for business. We keep clicking on it. Now, I'm not saying we are not to blame. We are. We're the idiots clicking on these links and watching this video. But there's a relatively small number of people who are responsible for the vast majority of disinformation. And it is not nearly as hard of a problem to fix as we think. It's just one of corporate priorities. We are prioritizing our profits over what is good for societies, democracies, and individuals. And it's as simple as that. And the reason we're doing that, by the way, is because they can. There's no liability. Right? You have a video on your platform that leads to real-world harms, either through COVID disinformation, or selling illegal weapons, or drugs, or non-consensual pornography. You can't get sued. You have protection from the federal government under what's called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. So there's no incentive. There's no incentive like there is with product liability. You create a product that harms me, you're going to get the bejesus suit out of you. And as it should be. That's what keeps the companies creating safer products that don't hurt us. You can't say that about the technology sector. Okay. So let me summarize all of that. Disrupting disinformation is not, it is not, and do not let Mark Zuckerberg tell you otherwise, it is not tractable. And when Mark Zuckerberg, by the way, tells you that you don't want him to be the arbiter of truth, would you please explain to him that he is? Because his algorithms decide every minute of every day what is being pushed onto your newsfeed. It is the most disingenuous of comments to suggest somehow, by limiting harm on your platform, you are the arbiter of truth. You are absolutely the arbiter of what is being seen because you are maximizing your profits, not what is good for us as individuals and societies and democracies. So do not let him get away with that line. By the way, do not also let him get away with the line of free speech, because this is total crap. On Facebook, from day one, Mark Zuckerberg and his cronies banned legal adult pornography. Not only is it legal, it is the hallmark of most First Amendment law in this country, and he banned it. Why? Because he loves the First Amendment so much. No, he banned it because advertisers don't want their ads running against sexually explicit material, even if it's legal. He had no problem infringing on your First Amendment rights when it made it profitable for him, but suddenly, when it's Holocaust deniers and people doing horrific things to other human beings, he's like, I'm a First Amendment purist. It's crap. So, I would argue that not only is the problem relatively small, and not only is it technically feasible, as we saw YouTube do, because it's a relatively small number of people, but now the problem is you are running against trillion-dollar companies, 5 of them in particular, and you are now asking them to do something that is directly not in their financial interest, and I don't think anybody here is naive enough to think that, well, we should be able to solve this very quickly. By the way, Facebook did a really interesting experiment a couple years back called Good for the World, Bad for the World. Most dystopian experiment ever. What they did is they changed the news feed of a bunch of people. And they said, rate this article as that it's qualitatively good or bad, good or bad, good or bad. And people did that, a couple 100,000 users. And then they started promoting things that are good for the world and demoting things that are bad for the world. And guess what? It worked. The news feeds got nicer. But you know what else happened? People spent less time on Facebook. So you know what Facebook did? They literally turned off the algorithm called good for the world. And they turned on the algorithm called bad for the world. We know how to solve these problems. We are simply choosing not to. We cannot wait for the corporate giants to do this. We need for the US government, the EU government, the British government, the Australian government, governments around the world to insist that these companies do better. And that is, in my opinion, the only thing that is going to work. So we've tried ad boycotts, we've tried media blitzes, we've tried people deleting their accounts, and it's not working. These companies are literally too big to fail. Okay, although you should all delete your Facebook accounts, and Instagram, and TikTok. Okay, so now let's, I'm going to just stop here because I'm going to transition to deepfakes. Anybody want to give me a hard time about something?
I just feel like the explanation for why anonymity is allowed on the internet. The problem would go away if you had to be identifiable.
Yeah. Okay, the question is about anonymity on the internet. Why are you allowed to be anonymous on the internet? This is like grabbing the third rail of conversations around technology, but whatever, I have tenure. I have mixed feelings about it. So on the one hand, you're right. People say and do things on the internet that they would never do in person, and part of that is anonymity, and part of it is just the medium a little bit. On the other hand, there are people in marginalized groups, people in other parts of the world, in autocratic societies, that need to speak truth to power, and that is harder to do if you don't have anonymity. So here in our very coveted Western world, it's easy to look at that and say, well, you know, we have a reasonably functional democracy most days. But in other parts of the world, it doesn't look like this. And anonymity has been a huge boom for those people. And so I think there has to be a balance. And there is a middle ground here, by the way. So anonymity has two parts to it. One is you are not anonymous, you are anonymous to everybody, right? The company, the government, and you and me on the internet. There's another one then where you can be anonymous, but the company may somehow know who you are, and then, you know, under the right conditions can reveal that information. I think you have to tread very lightly here around anonymity, because I think that there is potentially unintended harm. I agree with you, I think it is part of the problem, but I don't think the solution is as simple as, well, let's eliminate anonymity. I think it's going to end up being more complicated, but I think it's a fair point. Please.
What about just overturning Section 230?
Excellent. What about, okay, so let me tell you what Section 230 is. Okay, so Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act is an amendment to the Communications Decency Act, which was written to limit the spread of adult pornography to minors. By the way, CDA was shut down by the Supreme Court shortly after it was passed, but 230 survived. And what 230 says is that if you are in the user-generated content business, you cannot be held liable for what users say on your platform. So if I defame somebody on Facebook, Facebook is not responsible. And it also says that, if you do content moderation, you cannot be responsible for missing something, and if you don't do content moderation, you're not responsible for harm. It is the mother of all gifts to the technology sector, okay? It was also written at a time when the primary internet platforms were AOL. So let's agree that things have shifted a little bit. So the problem with eliminating 230, and there are proposals to do that, is that you will eliminate all of social media. And don't get me wrong, I'm not fundamentally opposed to that, but I also understand that I'm in the minority here. If you eliminate 230, it's game over, right? There is no more social media, okay? Again, I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing, but I don't think most people would agree. I think instead of eliminating 230, you have to reform it. 230 was called the Good Samaritan Law. It was intended to say that if you're trying to be a good citizen, we're not going to hold you responsible or liable. And it has become the Bad Samaritan Law, right? That the absolute worst actors in this space get protection from 230, and I don't think that was the intent. Now, there have been slight modifications. There's Sesta Fosta, which goes after people trafficking in young children, and there are any number of proposals coming down the road that are going to try to limit the scope a little bit. I think that's probably the way to go, is slowly start limiting the liability shield to force the companies to at least think about the harms because they're going to have liability. And there are any number of cases now making their way through the state and federal appellate courts where the judges have grown impatient with 230 protects me, and you're now starting to see some penetration for liability. Snap got in trouble last year. They got sued and they lost. Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, all of these companies are now starting to feel the heat, and I think that's what's going to start to help a little bit. Yes?
So you offered a way that it might be easy to cut down maybe 50% of the content. But aren't you opening up another war?
Good.
Conspiracy theorists, you do that, and they'll just find a way to get around your easy solution, and you'll be in a back and forth war with them.
Yeah.
And they tend to win those wars.
Yeah. Hey, Jeff, good to see you. It's the right question. So if you cut off the head of the snake, are you just going to grow 10 more heads, right? And the answer is probably, but that's tomorrow's problem. So here's the other answer to that, Jeff, is that I think this is sort of like the spam and anti-spam problem, right? You can say, well, look, if you start putting spam filters, aren't you going to just make better spam? And the answer is, well, yeah, but then the filters get better, and then the spam gets better, and the filter gets better, and eventually, it takes a while, but we more or less have spam under control. It took 20 years, but I think this is going to unfold like that. But right now, there is no barrier to entry. You literally had Macedonian teenagers interfering in our election in 2016, right? That's insane. A bunch of teenagers making a buck on ads changed our election. So I think what we need to do is raise the bar. This should be more difficult, more painful, more time-consuming, more effortful, and I think you start to sort of narrow the problem a little bit. But you are absolutely right. It's an arms race, right? We fix one problem. All right, now they come in another door. All right, I'm going to go close that door, but I don't know what else to do, is my answer. Yeah? Okay. Yes, one more question.
What about nonprofit alternatives or competition for market model organizations? Suppose we had, you mentioned BBC, suppose, or C-SPAN.
Yeah.
Suppose we had social media versions of those.
Good. Here's the problem with monopolies. Creating competition is hard. Right? I mean, you have basically Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube, and they dominate the landscape. So the good news is the EU passed the DMA, I'm going to forget what it stands for, but it's putting pressure for these anti-competitive behaviors. And by the way, when Google comes around and starts whining about government interfering, would you please remind them that the reason they exist is because the Department of Justice slapped around Microsoft for using their market dominance back in the 80s to control the internet? Government control here is good to create a fair marketplace. And so I think that's the way to do it, is you have to come in with antitrust. And you have to create oxygen in the room. We also need to talk to the VCs down the road here and tell them to stop funding the same stupid business model over and over again and expecting a different outcome. There are better models out there. We're just not, we don't have the oxygen in the room. Okay, let's move on to the next section. Is somebody going to keep me on time? I guess I have a clock here. Hold on.
11:42.
When am I supposed to stop talking?
Like 12, dude. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Good luck with that. If you navigate to this website, thispersondoesnotexist.com, great website. There is nothing deceptive about the name. You will be presented with an image of a person who doesn't exist. All the people that you see here don't exist. They were synthesized by a computer algorithm. And that is the sort of the nugget of what a deepfake is, and that's what we're going to talk about. So the first thing you want to ask is, how does it do this? So let's just talk about how these things are generated. It's incredibly complicated, but also conceptually very simple. Here's the idea. You have two systems, a generator and a discriminator. Generator's job is to make an image of a person. So it starts by literally splatting down a bunch of random pixels. That's what you see in the top over there. Yeah? And it hands that to the discriminator, and the discriminator has access to a bunch of actual people's faces. And it says, can I tell the difference between that noise pattern and people? The answer is, well, sure. It just builds a what's called a classifier, and it says, okay, it's not a person. So it goes back to the generator and says, this isn't a person. Generator modifies some pixels, sends it back to the discriminator. Nope, still not a person. Go back, go back, go back. And they cycle like this over and over and over and over again, millions and millions and millions of times. And eventually it will synthesize an image of a face. When you hand it to the discriminator, it says, yeah, that looks like a face. This is called a GAN, Generative Adversarial Network. Generative because you're making something. Adversarial because you've pitted two systems against each other. And network because underneath those two boxes, the computational machinery is called a neural network. Okay? The details of that don't matter. And that's it. That's what a GAN is, right? Lots of details on how you tune these things and stabilize them and blah, 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 blah. But, you know, somebody took some code that NVIDIA created called StyleGAN 2 now and stuck it up on a web page, and you can go there and generate images of people who don't exist and then create fake profiles, and that's what people are doing. So, all the people on the top there are fake, and all the people down on the bottom are real. And you can look for yourself to see, you don't have a great resolution here, you're pretty far from the screen, but the second question you want to ask about these images is, well, how good are they? Are they actually really, can you really fool people? I mean, I've shown them a little small here, maybe they're not that good. So Sophie Nightingale and I were curious about this, and we ran a perceptual study where we showed somebody an image, and we simply asked, do you think this is a real person or is it synthesized? And we explained to them what a synthesized image is and what a GAN is and so on and so forth. And we did this online. Mechanical Turk, hundreds and hundreds of participants, look at a bunch of images, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. Yeah. Horizontal axis is how accurate they were. Chance is 50%. This is a distribution or a histogram, so the vertical axis is the count. We had 315 participants. The median accuracy, which you can see is that big bar in the middle, is 50%. People are a chance, right? A few people are a little bit better, a few people are a little bit worse. It's within the margin of error. These images are indistinguishable from real people when you just look at a single image. That is a huge success for the people who develop these machines. It is an amazing thing to have accomplished. Really, it's impressive. Now, these are naive, what we call naive participants. They don't know anything, they're just online making a buck doing some tasks for us. And so we did a second study where we trained them. So at the beginning of the experiment, we tell them what a GAN is, we tell them what the artifacts are, and on every trial, we give them feedback. Nope, you got that wrong. Yeah, you got that right. No, you got that wrong. To sort of get them better. Yeah? And now, accuracy is just under 60%, chance is 50%. So they get a little bit better, but this is a really hard problem. It is not just that you don't know what you're doing. And by the way, we incentivize our participants. We tell them we're going to triple their pay if they get above a certain percent accuracy to incentivize them to do well. Okay? So we have passed, in terms of still images, through the uncanny valley. We can now synthesize images of people who don't exist. And by the way, my favorite application of this was a high school student in Florida who was bored during his Christmas break. And he decided to create a fictional candidate to run for US Congress, which probably would be better than some of the actual candidates that we have. So he created a webpage with a profile picture from this person does not exist. He got the person authenticated by the Board of Elections. He got the Twitter blue check mark with an authenticated account, and he is running a fictional candidate for Congress before anybody figures out what has gone wrong. I want to hire this kid. It's awesome. People have been using these images to create fake profiles on LinkedIn, on social media, which are then being used to either scam people or push disinformation. So you're seeing these things. Really cool third experiment I just want to mention. So people can't tell the difference between real or fake. And we were curious if there was some other characteristic of the faces that maybe they were latching onto. So we asked about trustworthiness. This is a well-known characteristic that people will assess the faces. And so again, fake images on the top, a real image on the bottom. Look at an image, completely new set of participants, and we say, rate them from 1, very untrustworthy, to 7, very trustworthy. Fake faces are rated slightly, but statistically significantly more trustworthy than the real faces. By the way, there's a really good reason for this, we think, which is that fake faces tend to look more like average faces because of an artifact of a synthesis engine, and average faces are known to be more trustworthy. So it's just sort of this interesting little side effect. So not only are they indistinguishable, you actually think they're slightly more trustworthy, which is really amazing. All right, now, where things get really interesting is when you go from images to video. Okay? So how does a video deepfake work? There's lots of different versions of it. I'm going to describe one. So we're going to take an image of Jennifer Lawrence, and we're going to change her identity to be Steve Buscemi. Why? Because the internet is weird, and these are the kinds of things the internet does. Okay? So now, the generator's job is not to create a new person, but it's to change the identity from eyebrow to chin, cheek to cheek. But now it has to do 2 things. So it's going to change a bunch of pixels and send it to the discriminator, and the discriminator has a bunch of images not of people, but of Steve Buscemi, or whoever. And it says, is that Steve Buscemi? But it also needs to respect the overall appearance of the original frame. That is, the person should be looking down in a particular expression, the lighting, because we're going to just replace the face, not just create an image of Steve Buscemi. Again, it's a GAN. So do it over and over and over again, respect the appearance, is it Steve Buscemi or not, over and over and over and over again. Okay? And if you do that on every image of every frame of an entire video, you get something like this.
Expected me to win, so I just like, it was just, this was very truly surprising for me.
Yeah. I guess I cut the video short. Sorry, it goes on forever. Just go to YouTube and watch it, despite what I told you about YouTube. It's pretty good. By the way, this video is now about 3.5 years old. This is actually pretty old technology, but pretty good. Here's a more cutting edge one.
Expected Amy.
What's up, TikTok? You guys cool if I play some sports? I love it. More for the audio experience. As much as the momentum. Hey, listen up, sports and TikTok fans. If you like what you're seeing, just wait till what's coming next.
All right, so first of all, when this video came out, we were contacted by a bunch of press, and I was sitting in my office with Shruti Agrawal, who I mentioned earlier on, and we had never seen anything that looked quite this good. And there was a moment when we both thought, I wonder if this is the real Tom Cruise, pretending to be a deepfake Tom Cruise. Because that would be awesome. Because then you get to do whatever you want, right? Have fun. So this is a deepfake made by a very, very talented graphic artist in, I want to say Denmark, but I may have gotten the country wrong, sorry. And really is probably cutting edge deepfake technology where now an entire person's identity has been co-opted. So underneath that is an actor who obviously looks a little bit like Tom Cruise, got the hair going on, got the voice going on, but now we can create full-blown videos of people saying and doing things that they never did, right? And so that's a sort of different ballgame, yeah? So, 3 types of deepfakes. The face swap, that's what I just showed you. You take somebody talking and you replace them eyebrows to chin, cheek to cheek. Lots of great things you can do. My single favorite one is Nick Cage in The Sound of Music. He's on the top of the mountain, spinning around, singing. It's fantastic. You should go watch it. Puppet Master deepfake. This is a relatively new one where now what you do is you have a single image of a person, and that's the puppet, and then the master just sits in front of a camera, and as they move and talk and express, it animates that single image. Okay? And so I can get Putin to say anything I want. Lip sync deepfake, you take a video of somebody saying something and you simply replace their mouth to be consistent with a new audio track. And so the only thing that's actually being manipulated is the mouth. And all of these have slightly different technologies, but the basic idea is the same. You are creating a video of somebody saying and doing something that they did not. These have already been weaponized. We are seeing them weaponized primarily and early on in the form of non-consensual sexual imagery. People taking women's likenesses, putting them into sexually specific material, and then carpet bombing the internet, either as a form of weaponization around lawyers, politicians, human rights activists, people who attract unwanted attention, and for some people, this is their idea of entertainment. Vast majority, and this, by the way, there are dozens and dozens of apps and websites that will do this, and it is awful. Disinformation campaigns, we've already seen that happening. There was a deepfake of President Zelensky that was released a couple months ago saying, we surrender, everybody dropped their weapons, and it was on Ukraine TV for a few hours. That's pretty bad. There was a live deepfake made where the mayor of Berlin, Vienna, and Madrid were on a video conference call for over 20 minutes with a deepfake version of the mayor of Kyiv. That's live, real time, by the way. Right? That's insane. And no sense that something was wrong. Right? 20 minutes talking to another human being, you don't know anything's wrong. Political campaigns. What happens when we start getting these introduced into political campaigns? My favorite example of this was an interesting reversal where the current president of South Korea created deep fakes of himself, saying like really funny things and being much, much more engaging than he actually is in real life. And he won, by the way, by 0.8%. Some people attribute that digital footprint to his victory. Obviously, on the national security front, as we try to reason about the world around us, how do you do that when anything that you see now could be fake? Any audio, any image, any video, a satellite image, a video of a bombing in Ukraine. How do you reason about a very complex, fast-moving world? We've already seen massive frauds. In the UAE and the UK, millions of dollars are being stolen using fraudulent video and audio to mimic somebody else's identity and to get funds transferred. Again, I've already mentioned that this has been deployed during war. And here's the thing, if those don't keep you up at night, this is what should keep you up at night, is what the so-called liar's dividend. And what the liar's dividend posits is that as we enter a world where you can no longer believe an image or a video or an audio, which used to be the hallmark of proof, well then, anything can be fake. Nothing has to be real. So, here's a good example. Then candidate Trump gets himself in trouble with the Access Hollywood tape. Remember this? He said really awful things. And he apologized. Back in 2015, he said, I'm sorry, that was not appropriate. Yeah. Elected president, somehow. Fast forward a year, deepfake technology is now starting to evolve, and he's asked about that tape again. You know what he said? It's fake. Why'd you apologize in the first place? It doesn't matter. It's fake. That's it. Now we can just dismiss inconvenient facts, right? I still get hate mail from people who are convinced that George Floyd never died, that that video is a deep fake. Right? It's easy to dismiss reality when you think that things can be manipulated. And that's, I think, in some ways, the deepest threat of deepfakes. Okay, so I'm running a little low on time, so I'm going to talk about one technique that we've been developing to try to detect these deepfakes. Yeah, and then we can have a little Q&A. So I'm going to show you a series of very short clips of President Obama at the beginning of his weekly addresses when he was in the White House. See if you notice anything.
Hi everybody, 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 hi everybody.
God, I really miss him. Did you notice it? The head tilt back. Hi everybody, hey everybody, hey everybody. He's got this little, like, just, you know, this thing he does, right? And so we all have mannerisms. I talk with my hands a lot. I raise my eyebrows in a particular way. I have asymmetries in my expressions. We all have specific ways of talking, right? These mannerisms, yeah? And so here's my favorite one of President Obama. Horizontal axis is time. This is 10 seconds. And on the vertical axis is how much he's doing two things. Rotating his head up and down, as if nodding in the affirmative, and smiling or frowning. Up is smiling, down is frowning. And what do you notice? They're correlated. So he has this interesting little mannerism. When he frowns, he tends to tilt his head down, and when he smiles, he tilts his head up a little bit. Actually, up and to the left a little bit. Yeah? Sort of little thing, yeah? Okay? Let's create a lip sync deep fake. Remember what a lip sync is? I replace the mouth with a new audio track. So now, the mouth is doing its thing, but it doesn't know about the head. Right? It's been desynchronized. So now, same plot. Horizontal axis is time, orange is frowning, smiling, and blue is head tilt, and they're decoupled. It's a chimera. Right? So you've disrupted something. And of course, if it's a face swap or a puppet master, the entire person moving is doing something else. Yeah? So now, that's Obama. Trump is a little bit different. So Trump's motions, time, intensity, now it's two other things. It's how wide the mouth is open, that's an orange, and then the chin pucker, right? So with Trump, they're decorrelated. So when he opens his mouth, he doesn't pucker his chin, but when he closes his mouth, he puckers his chin, okay? Now, we created a bunch of face swap deepfakes using Alec Baldwin as the source. Fantastic, by the way. Go watch those Saturday Night Live skits. So that's Trump's face on Alec Baldwin. So Alec Baldwin has a caricature of Trump. And he does the mouth open and the chin pucker, but he correlated them. Right? He got the relationship wrong. And we don't care because it's this caricature of it, and it sort of works, and who notices whether things are correlated or decorrelated. And so again, you've disrupted this mannerism. So here's what we do. So this is work that Matthias has been working on. So we've been focusing on Zelensky for obvious reasons. We've seen deepfakes of him. It's a particularly difficult time in Ukraine. So we track the face over time, and we get head motion, how you're rotating your head. We track all the features on your face, and we get facial expressions, raising your eyebrows, opening your mouth, puckering your chin, frowning, smiling, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we get all the mannerisms and expressions of your head and face. We also track your upper body. So how are you moving your hands and your shoulders? Are you raising your hands? Are you lowering your hands? Do you talk with your hands? Do you not talk with your hands? There's another row here, which I'm going to ignore right now, which is vocal. We actually look at your vocal signal, because when you turn your head, the vocal signal changes because you're away from the microphone. When you turn your head up, you stretch this area so the vocal signal changes. I won't talk about that, but it's in there as well. And then what we do is we collect a bunch of data of President Zelensky. We literally go to the Ukraine office of the president's webpage. They've got hours and hours and hours of video under different situations. We got him in a formal setting, at the podium, in the bunker, and his desk. We have another one here now where he's been doing selfies recently, where he's holding the phone and talking. It's a slightly different way that he has to talk because one of his hands is now occupied. We have about 8 hours of video. We extract all of those measurements, and we find all the correlations and decorrelations that are unique to him. I won't talk about the computational machinery to do that. And then we compare that to deepfakes. So here is the accuracy of our classifier from 0 to 100%. With all of the features in our system, which is about 500 of them, we are almost at 100% accuracy. We're at 99.95% accuracy to distinguish Zelensky from people who are not Zelensky, and deepfakes of Zelensky that we had companies that make professional deepfakes make for us, and we can distinguish them with almost perfect accuracy. The graph here shows what's called an ablation study. I'm going to just skip that for now for the sake of time. Okay, oh, I'm going to mention this one because it's so cool. So the way we figured out that in fact TikTok Tom Cruise was not Tom Cruise was this right here. So that is deepfake Tom Cruise's ear, and because the internet is so weird, you can go onto Google and say, Tom Cruise ear photo, and you can find like 1,000 photos of Tom Cruise's ear. How great is the internet? Every once in a while it delivers. He has an attached earlobe. So the face swap deepfake is cheek to cheek, eyebrow to chin. It doesn't do this. There's one feature that it can't do yet, right? So not only can we do what are called ear biometrics, which is actually a well-known thing, but also when my mouth is moving, my ears tend to move a little bit. And so we have another technique that also looks at the dynamics of how your ear moves as you talk. Yeah? Super cool. I'm going to skip this. Okay, so let me wrap up. Only 1 minute.
You're fine, you're fine.
She was giving me the evil eye. Just cut the mic at some point, right? Okay. So Shruti, Matthias, Mark, and Sophie did the lion's share of all of this work. So let me just summarize. So I started off by talking about disinformation broadly. And I contend that the problem is not nearly as hard as the social media companies will have us believe. That there's a modulo Jeff's comment, which I think is a good one, is that we can start tackling this problem. It is not a technical problem. It is not a volume problem. It is a priority problem. And I completely agree with the question of, well, if you tackle this problem, won't you just open up another door? Sure, then I'll tackle that problem. And I'll tackle the next one and the next one and the next one, because that's the way it goes. But we need larger movements to get these tech companies to move. Deep fakes are just, don't get, there's a lot of talk in the media about deep fakes as if it's somehow the end of the world as we know it. I don't think that's true, but I do think that it is a significant threat in terms of the larger disinformation landscape. And we should think about it within the larger disinformation landscape. We should think about it with respect to algorithmic amplification, the way recommendation algorithms work, and other forms of disinformation. But this technology is moving very, very, very fast. The latest thing is now what's called OpenAI's paint by text, where you don't need all this data. You literally go to their webpage and you type in, give me an image of President Zelensky surrendering, and it will render an image of that for you, fully automatically, right? Holy crap, now we're in a different world, right? And so this technology, because machine learning and AI and computing is developing so fast, is moving very, very fast. And I do think that it is a significant risk, but one that we should think of within the larger context of disinformation. And the last thing I'll say is to emphasize again that what I'm most worried about is that when it gets too easy to deny reality, we are then going to get caught up in that liar's dividend. That we are becoming more and more polarized politically and socially, and that we are not disagreeing on policy, we are disagreeing on facts. 1 million people, over 1 million people in the United States have died from COVID. No, they haven't. Yes, they have. No, they haven't. That's not, we can't address our problems when we can't agree on basic facts, basic numbers, basic statistics. And that, I would argue, is an existential threat to our society and our democracy. And that's something we have to take very, very seriously, which is not just about technology, it's about education, it's about government, it's about leadership, and it's about corporate priorities. And that, I think, is the bigger issue here that we need to start thinking about more broadly, because I think technology is starting to rip us to shreds. And that is not the internet that I signed up for. All right, thanks everybody. All right, bring it.
So you talked a little bit about maybe regulating some of the corporations or whatever, but what about from the other end, I've heard about inoculation against corporations, or what about that?
Yeah, like pre-bunking, I think they call it. Yeah. So Zelensky, who I think is awesome, by the way, as the war was starting, he said, the Russians are going to create a deep fake of me saying I surrender, do not believe it. So he pre-bunked it. And part of the reason why the video didn't get traction is because he warned us it was coming. So I do think that's interesting. In fact, one of the things we are working on is trying to catch these conspiracies before they take off. right? Because QAnon could have been stopped, right? It started off on these really fringy sites, the chant sites, moved over to Reddit, and eventually showed up on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, and then it magnetized, I don't know what that word is. It became a tumor before anybody could figure out, and then it's over. It's done. But if you can see these things, as we do, by the way, in epidemiology, right? We see something is coming, we have interventions, right? So I do think that's important, and one of the things that we are working on now is both understanding the spread of disinformation, who's doing it, what their motivations are, but also trying to predict what is going to go viral, what is going to catch, and then how do we put roadblocks in there, yeah? And I think that's a really great question. I think it's super important to do that. I think you also have to be careful. I think you can't run around beating people over the head saying this is true, this is not true. I think you have to do it with some grace and some subtlety, and you have to get people to get there. As much as I'd like to beat people over the head and tell them what's true and what's not true, I don't think that's the way to do it. So what the interventions will look like, how fact-checking should work online, is a really interesting problem. Like when you put labels on things saying this isn't true, it doesn't work, right? It just doesn't work. So I think there's some really interesting psychology and human-computer interactions that I think we have to think about how do we make these interventions.
A little bit lower where you left it. You see all the criteria you use to detect the deep fake, and you turn around and use to perfect it.
Excellent. So the question is, you're making things worse. You're I'm sorry, I'm paraphrasing. You are generating techniques to detect deepfakes, so why aren't you going to make just better deepfakes? Here's why. And by the way, 100% the right question. And we think very carefully about that. Here's why our techniques cannot be weaponized against us. Remember when I said about the creation of deepfakes? It's one frame at a time, right? We analyze hundreds of frames at a time. The current synthesis engines can't do anything about these signals, number one. They can't. They can't reason out hundreds of frames. That's number one. Number two is, the engines don't know anything about facial expressions and hand movements and gestures, right? It's just pushing pixels around, so it doesn't have that semantic understanding that we have, number two. Number three, and here's the big one, we don't release our code. So, good luck. And look, I wrestle with this, right? We are academics, we are a public institution, our job is to push the scientific frontier forward. So, but we also don't want our work being directly weaponized against us, whether or not it's difficult to do or not. So what we have decided on, whether it's the right decision or not, I think there's a reasonable argument, is that we will publish the papers, but we will not release the data, we will not release the code, we will not open source it. So we work with certain organizations, press organizations, government organizations, to make the work available so they can do the hard work that they need to do, but we do not make it broadly available. And since I'm on this topic, maybe the people who are generating the technology to create deepfakes should also think about this, right? Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. If we now know the technology we are developing is being used to create non-consensual sexual imagery and push disinformation campaigns, maybe you shouldn't just put it on GitHub and sit back and say, well, let's see what happens next, right? It's not, technology is not inherently good. It's not just like all technology is good. And I actually think, as they have in physics and chemistry and biology and the more mature sciences, maybe we should think about the implications. Do we really want to be developing face recognition that can recognize you out of a crowd of 8 billion people and unleash it on the public and say, well, I think we really can't see anything that can go wrong here. So maybe we should think about that on both sides as well. Yeah.
The problem also is not just a technology problem, because the other night on the Tucker Carlson show, they showed a dumb fake, right? They showed
cheap fake, they're called.
Cheap fake, right. They showed a judge who had written the warrant for the
Trump raid, yeah.
Right, and they just photoshopped.
Yeah.
Photoshopped in instead of Epstein.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And so, like that problem, enhances the problem you're talking about.
I agree.
It's not a technology problem. It's not that.
Yeah, I'm going to repeat the question. So if you haven't seen it, it's going to shock you to learn that something on Tucker Carlson's show was not true. God, I'm going to get a lot of hate mail for this. In Tucker Carlson's show, they showed an image, a photoshopped image of the judge who signed the warrant in the raid of Mar-a-Lago, and it was a photoshopped image where they took an image of Epstein and Maxwell on a private plane, and they spliced the judge's face onto that. It was not a deep fake, it is so-called a cheap fake, it was Photoshopped. And your argument is that you don't need machine learning and AI to do bad things, and you're absolutely right. This is part of a continuum, right? But here's what I would argue is the difference, is that was a pretty cheap fake, but at least somebody needed Photoshop. They needed to go find some images, they need to do something. But now go from there to, I'm gonna go to a web page and type in, give me an image of this, and it will synthesize it automatically. It's the democratization that I think is the threat, is that it makes it more and more available to more and more people, so the threat increases. And that is the risk. But you are 100% right. The Nancy Pelosi videos purportedly showing her drunk were just slowed down. No deep fakes, no AI, just make her sound drunk. Do it for yourself, by the way, it's hysterical. It's great. My students were doing it during my lecture. They were just slowing down the video, so I sounded really drunk. Fantastic. Yes, in the back.
You mentioned something about account transfers, and then you said in the Middle East. I'm always worried about my bank account being hacked.
Yeah, you should be. Yeah, so this was in the UAE. It was not at that level, so there was a merger happening between two companies. An AI voice called the bank that was synthesized in the voice of the person who was supposed to be making the transfer and convinced them to transfer, I think it was like $30 million or so. That's a separate problem than the security of your checking account, which you should be worried about because passwords are being leaked all the time. This is outside of my area of expertise, but a few things since we're on the topic is, you should use a password manager. You should not use the same password. You should not use your street name. Every single account should have a completely different, random, 20-character password. You stick them into a password manager. You never have to remember anything. You go to a web page. It auto-fills it in for you. That's the bare minimum you should be doing to secure your accounts. Yeah. I think that the thing you should worry about in terms of these AI threats that we're going to start to see are these personalized attacks. So we get phishing scams all the time, right? We get these text messages. Those are going to start getting personalized. So now it's not going to be some random phone number saying, hey, how you doing? It's going to be a video of somebody saying something to you, or an audio of somebody saying something to you. They're going to be highly personalized attacks. They're going to be phishing attacks, and that is already starting to happen. So there is a new threat there, but it is on the horizon. Yes, please.
They're starting to teach media literacy in more and more schools. What would you want them to include in media literacy for?
Good. Delete Facebook. No, I already said that. Sorry. God, that is a great question. The question was that we are starting to teach media literacy. I believe in France, by the way, it is now mandated. It has been inserted. I think this is really important. I think there's a few things I would like for people to understand. One is, stop being a jerk online. Honestly, we do and say things to each other online that we would not do in person. And I think there has been a long time we have thought that there are these two worlds, that there's the online world and the offline world. And the online world is like Las Vegas, right? What happens on the internet stays on the internet. So who cares? Who cares? It doesn't matter. It's a bunch of pixels and digits. But it's not. There is no more online and offline world. There is one world. And what we do online has implications in the offline world and vice versa. So I think getting people to understand, per the anonymity question too, is that what you say and do online actually matters, number one. Number two is the ability to, first of all, stop, for the love of God, getting news from social media. Really, what are we doing? This is insane. People getting information about the war from TikTok. We've got to understand that whether you like them or not, or whether you agree with them or not, the amazing journalists, editors who work at major news outlets do a really, really good job, and they take their job seriously. And yes, they make mistakes, but they are not going out of their way to make mistakes for the most part. And so I think we have to go back to understanding what media is and treat Facebook and TikTok for what it was meant to be, which is entertainment and talking to your friends, and not mix up these two things of news and information and entertainment. It's gotten too messy. By the way, I don't think cable news is much better either. I think it has also sort of blurred this line between entertainment and information. But I think how you get information and how you fact check information and where you go and how you reason about these things, I think has to start getting taught at an early age. And stop being a jerk. Not you, everyone else. Yes, please.
So I was thinking that one of the issues is authentication, like how it might be easier for algorithms to verify that it's you if there was a way to authenticate it. And I know there's technologies like NFTs and that kind of stuff that may allow that to happen.
Yeah.
Is there any work done in that?
Yeah. So the question is about authentication. And so I'm part of an initiative called the C2PA, the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authentication. Yeah? It's a not-for-profit, multi-stakeholder from Microsoft and Twitter and Adobe and lots of different companies. And here's the idea. So everything I've talked about here is sort of after the fact. Right? People produce stuff, they take pictures, they break stuff, gets online, somebody sees it, eventually shows up at my desk, and we try to figure out what's going on. First of all, that's insane. So the other way to think about it is that when I take this thing out, and I take a photo or an image or an audio recording, who is in the best position to authenticate it? This device. So what C2PA does is it solves what's called the glass-to-glass problem. This piece of glass is the first one, this piece of glass where somebody's reading it is the second one. So in the first piece of glass, the device, either in hardware or software, authenticates the time and date, the geolocation, and everything that was recorded with cryptographic signatures. It gets attached to the piece of content. And then as that piece of content makes its way through a publisher, through editing, and eventually to the last piece of glass, you can then say, okay, who took this? When was it taken? Is it authentic with respect to what was recorded? I really like this technology. Number one is we understand the technology and it works. It's using well understood technology. Number two is it shifts the burden where it belongs, right? It's insane to say we're going to distribute this stuff to the world, to billions of people, and everybody's on their own to figure out what's real and what's not real. The person producing it should be responsible for proving authentication, and that's what this does. Here's the other thing I like about it, it scales. It scales to 8 billion people in the world. The problem is you need infrastructure. Right? You've got to get the companies to sort of get on board with this. The good news is right now there's some 700 companies part of the initiative. Interestingly, only one of those is a social media company. Right? So you can see where the problem is. But we're in the early stages. The first end-to-end spec is out. There is traction on this, and I'm hoping that in the coming years, because this is measured in years, that this will sort of, in addition to some of the other things that we are doing at the other end of it, try to meet in the middle. But I think it's a super interesting approach to it, and I think it's promising from my perspective. Yes?
I'm thinking about, maybe it's a very ended question about, in the future, now we have these goggles, right? And you got basically, you have the fake or immersion fake world. But also you probably have the digital signature of all these identification you can do. Can you maybe just generally, what do you think
about that? Yeah. So the question is essentially about the metaverse. So what happens when we enter a world where we've gone from desktop computers to laptop computers to strapping these things to our face 24 hours a day to now literally strapping a device to your face? Here, by the way, is my impression of Mark Zuckerberg in the metaverse. Take everything that is awful about Facebook and put it in 3D and strap it to your face. What could go wrong? I think the metaverse is crap, honestly. I mean, if you've ever seen any of what it is, I think it's awful. I do worry, if you haven't been, by the way, my wife is a computational neuroscientist and I'm the faculty here, and one of the things she studies is AR, augmented reality and virtual reality. So I've had a chance to play with these things. And they are unbelievably realistic. I mean, you strap one of these things to your face, and it is immersive. And it is frightening. I mean, you will not help. If they put you in a scary situation, you will not help but have a very serious physiological response to it. There are truly awful things happening in the current version of the metaverse. Kids are going in there and getting abused. Women are going in there and being abused. It is immediately a total hellhole. So I think, to me, it's just, this is not, and by the way, the worst part of this whole thing is the model of the metaverse, and Mark Zuckerberg has said this freely, is that we want to monetize every aspect of your behavior. And to me, that is completely uninteresting, and I think we should, as a society, reject this. I'm still on the fence about these, by the way. I think right now the benefits outweigh the drawbacks, but at some point, we're sort of getting there. But to me, the whole virtual reality for work, play, entertainment is silly. There are really interesting applications. They're fun for video games. I think for people dealing with trauma, they can be really interesting mechanisms for trying to address those things. But I think this idea that we're going to spend all day in a virtual reality headset is, no thank you. Not for me, at least. Yeah.
I'm interested in your notion of trying to validate news sources.
Yeah.
Because, and you said, you did admit that the cable news sources are questionable, which includes Fox.
Yeah.
But what are your thoughts on, how to be a little more objective about that? How do I know whether I should listen to this or that news source? Okay,
Yeah.
let's get into social media for news.
Yeah, good.
But the news outlets,
Yeah.
they come in all different flavors. How, not just me.
Yeah.
How are you, do you have some thoughts on how to make them more, kind of like your validated, How does he know that we're really getting valid news?
It's a great question. So the C2PA effort that I mentioned does not actually solve the problem. It solves a problem, which is that the image of the judge is not a real image, right? It solves that problem, or that this video did not happen, or this is not, in fact, a video of the January 6th insurrection. It's from somewhere else. So they're necessary, but they are not sufficient conditions. We need something else. Right? But I don't think you're going to get the cable news channels to change, but here's what has to change, I think, is that we as the public have to get outraged at being lied to. I think that's what has to change, Jeff, is that we have to decide that I want to decide for myself what is true, and I don't want some idiot on the television telling me that. And I don't know how to do that. I think that is part of the education. I forgot to ask the question. Yes, part of the education, it's part of the media literacy. And by the way, look, I like making fun of millennials as much as anybody else, but the real problem of disinformation is not young people. It's people with gray hair, right? The biggest purveyors of disinformation are people over the age of 60, right? So this is not a young person's problem. I think we have to think about the next generation, but Jeff, I don't have an answer to that. I don't know. And I worry about the impact of these, because social media is not a vacuum. A lot of that information is coming from the cable news, and then it's a vicious cycle. Right? Things start here, and they show up on social media, and vice versa. I don't know how to break that cycle. I don't know. It's leadership, it's legislation, it's people getting fed up, but I don't think we're close. And I don't think this is a uniquely American problem. Right? You're seeing the same problems all around the world. So I don't know. And I don't know how we have a democracy if we can't agree on basic facts. To me, that's really an existential crisis, Jeff. Right? You see why I don't sleep at night. Yes, please. Yes, I'm going to repeat that because I think you're absolutely right. Oh, let me repeat that and then you have to. So the comment was, it is worth paying for news, and I could not agree more for that. Right? News is expensive. Here's the line, by the way. Information is expensive. Disinformation is cheap. Yeah? And I completely agree with you. If you are trying to figure out how you can read the New York Times without paying for it, knock it off. Pay the $7 a month. It's literally the price of a latte, man. Right? We should pay for information that's important. Okay, you had a question.
And after deepfakes, you said you're working with news organizations. Can you talk a bit more about that? Is it easy for them to self-test with software?
Yeah, so the question is, I said I was working with some organizations and it's easy for them to test. So one of the things that's hard about this space is that, taking research ideas and putting them into a form that a journalist can use, right? Somebody who's not technical is very, very difficult. You've got to make these things really, really reliable. So this is what that young man right there is working on, Matthias, is building an interface that allows a very simple interface where you upload a video and we do all the hard work and taking the human out of the loop. And we are not there yet, but we think we will be there by the end of the year. And it's specifically for deep fakes of individuals. Joe Biden, President Alinsky, et cetera, et cetera. But we're hoping that we will be able to put this in the hands. And again, this doesn't solve our problems, but it gives the journalists at least that piece of information, and then they can do all of the rest of the hard work that they have to. Yeah. By the way, sorry, Liar's Dividend also showed up just last week. A bunch of Joe Biden, of course, had COVID. He did a bunch of press conferences, and people were claiming that he was dead, and they were all deep fakes. Welcome to the internet. Yes, please.
So there's a component that is sort of psychological, right?
Yeah,
so
sure.
One of the big things about it is we want to believe that if we want to believe it, we will accept the disinformation. It's much easier. We want to make America great again or Obama or hope. We want to believe it so bad that we let our guard down and accept some of these things. And there's like confirmation bias.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of stuff like that that I feel like that's an inherent problem that we have as human beings.
Yeah.
And how do we teach people, how do we guard against those kind of things?
Yeah, good. So the question is that we all have biases. Left, right, center, up, down. We can't deny that. And then there's confirmation bias. But I would argue that it's made even worse by the underlying social media engine, which reinforces the things that we've looked at before and has figured out what our bias is and keeps fanning that flame, right? So as if the problem wasn't bad enough, is this where you donate money to? No, sorry.
This is where they tell us how they feel about your event.
Ah, okay. Oh, sorry. Take that down, Jesus. So, sorry, I got distracted. I completely agree with you, by the way. So, I don't know how to deal with the human part of it. That's for the psychologists, right? But I think what's happening is we are making things way worse with technology, right? And we don't even know that we're making it worse. We don't even know we're in a rabbit hole in an echo chamber and talking to people that, just are simply confirming what we believe and normalizing, by the way, some pretty weird things. So I'm at that stage, but I agree with you, and it's sort of the question about media literacy. How do you get people to realize that they have this confirmation bias and respond to it? You should invite somebody from the psychology department to talk about that, because I think it's fascinating, and I just don't know. All right, maybe one more?
Yeah, how about one more?
Yeah.
I saw this hand right here. Yeah.
Yes, please.
You mentioned all sorts of different ways, regulatory policies, societal ways to deal with this, but I'm just curious, because you've been seeing just a technical aspect of it, you've seen this grow. So just within 3 years, we're getting to a point where you're even thinking is this real? So if 100, from 0 to 100, 100 is we can make movies that look real from, just pure from words. Where are we now, and where do you think the end game will be? Will it be like a spam classifier with 99% accuracy at war, or
good.
We're going to win or we're going to lose?
Good. On a scale of 0 to 100, I'm going to make it a linear scale, by the way. Where are we in the synthesis engine, right? In the synthesis part, to 100 being generate a movie of Tom Cruise, make Mission Impossible 6 for me.
And you can't use it'll have.
That's right.
Those semantic filters to catch.
That's right.
How do we get there?
That's right. That's right. While I think of the answer to that, let me tell you something. This is a professor's trick, by the way. I had a great math professor when I was in college. He said, start every answer with let epsilon be greater than 0. You always need epsilon be greater than 0, and it gives you time to think. Let epsilon be greater than 0. Here's a great story, by the way, to this question. OpenAI, the foundation that created DALL-E, the paint by text that I mentioned, recently trained an AI system to ingest a bunch of Jerry Seinfeld skits, and then it gave it a prompt, cat food. And the AI system generated a skit about cat food. You can go read it online, it's really funny. And then they synthesized his voice reading the skit. And it is amazing, right? Now, it's not a video of him talking, but it's semantically coherent. It's in his style of jokes, and in the speech is that same cadence that he has. Yeah? So that's not 100, but that's more than 50. I think we're somewhere between 50 and 100. But I think it's moving fast, and here's the one thing I know, having done this for a long time: do not try to predict the future. It's really, really hard. I don't know when we're going to get to 100, and I don't know if we will get to 100, but we will get close. I do think that OpenAI's DALL-E, which synthesizes still images from text, is phenomenal and eerie. You can type the craziest, weirdest things from the deep recesses of your brain, and it will generate an image for you. And so it's not a stretch then to do that for video. So I think you can probably measure that in years, not decades, is my guess. Now, on the other side, since you mentioned spam and anti-spam, my world is under 50, right? And the synthesis is above 50. First of all, playing defense is just really hard. It's just hard, number one. Number two is there are far fewer people in my field, in the forensic side of things, than there are in machine learning and AI and computer vision and computer graphics and natural language processing and all that. It's a huge, huge field. So we are a little bit outgunned. And playing defense is really hard. And now this stuff is also being commercialized. In addition to all the academics doing this, now you have companies getting in on it who are now pouring billions of dollars into monetizing and commercializing this, which is going to just turbocharge all of this. I don't think it's out of the stretch of the imagination that in your lifetime you will be able to go to a movie theater or rent a movie and replace actors for whoever you want. We're probably not far off. There's a company in Germany called Synesthesia that is doing auto dubbing. So you take a movie in one language, and it synthesizes a new voice and the mouth to be consistent with another language. Auto-dubbing movies now. Right? That's a step in that's essentially the first step in this. Yeah? So I don't think we're far off, is my prediction. Okay, are we happy?
We're totally happy.
Okay.
And I know you had mentioned suggesting a speaker. This is how you do it. We actually found Hany from somebody in our audience suggesting that he come speak with us. Yes, so if you have a suggested speaker from somebody at UC Berkeley you'd like to hear, please do that. Anything else you want to tell us about the event, do that as well. I have a gift, a Science at Cal shirt. We have medium and large.
You're going to get a this early. You should get at least a t-shirt out of it.
Yes, of course. We're so grateful, and again, we will see you next month. I think our first lecture is the one with the director of the new Center for Psychedelics. And also,
by the way, you should actually come to this talk. It is amazing.
Michael Silver, yep. And I think there's a chalk festival downtown, so you guys should get out there, chocolate and chalk. And thank you so much for being here. See you next month.